Josie Duggar has never been a vocal child. Nothing in her life had ever really been hers because she was born into a household that was governed by rigid rules, fervent religious convictions, and obedience to commands. Everyone else made all of her decisions, including her speech, views, and clothing choices, long before she could understand the idea of free will. She was raised under the strict Christian beliefs of her parents, which required her to be quiet, abstain from wrongdoing, and constantly think in line with their anticipations. Josie believed that life should be a never-ending cycle of victimization for a long time, but the perfect image she had always been familiar with began to fade as she grew older. Outside, everything seemed so different. She discovered that despite making more mistakes and laughing more, people were still content. She witnessed her older sisters struggle under these expectations as she started to question them. Some of them stayed devoted, but others quietly faded away. However, a small voice. She said to herself that if she just looked, things might be different. It was during this turbulent time that she met Justin. His beliefs were different from their religious communities in terms of humility, purity, and unshakable faith. Justin, an honest man who valued character over superficiality, worked in a tiny local car business. He was a good-hearted young man, too. They happened to meet by coincidence, and their first conversation was just two people talking about books and goals. But what started off as a light-hearted talk became into something deeper, something Josie had never experienced before. He listened to her as a person with her own ideas and opinions rather than as the famous Duggar daughter. Josie realized then that someone had taken notice of her. It was frightening to her to feel heard because unrequited love was considered disobedience. Time passed. They had private meetings, corresponded, and talked about subjects that were banned at home such as equality, hope, fear, and love. Justin never once asked her to change who she was. All he did was encourage her to think for herself. He helped her realize that she should be allowed to follow her own route in life, rather than attempting to distance her from her family. She discovered her damnation as well as her salvation. Nothing had changed in the Duggar household since that epiphany. Premeal prayers, family Bible readings, and the endless debate over obedience and faith. Jose was obviously no longer feeling anything. Although she had previously felt safe within those walls, but now she felt constrained. Every sermon on the topic of purity seemed to her like a burdensome burden. Her mother, Michelle, always encouraged her to follow the family's example and have confidence in God. Joss was thinking about screaming. No matter how much she loved her parents, she could no longer be their shadow. Josie eventually came to the realization that she could no longer conceal her relationship with Justin. She was concerned about her parents' responses. They may be surprised. They would undoubtedly sympathize with her, even if they chastised her. She was wrong. One evening after dinner, she plucked up the courage to speak. Her voice was trembling as she said. She told them that she was going to marry the man she had fell in love with. The moment she spoke, the air became cold. He looked at her as though she had betrayed all her father, Jim Bob, believed in. Michelle's eyes filled with incredulity and she gripped her Bible even more firmly. Initially, there was no rage, just a crushing silence that crushed her heart. Then the questioning started, the searing, never-ending questions. What brought him here? Did he find his spiritual home in their church? Was he successful? Were they in agreement with his beliefs? Jose's answers just made matters worse. Jim Bob's look became titanic when she acknowledged that Justin didn't belong there. It was wrong of him to say that. He claimed that she was being misled by the world and its temptations. Michelle pleaded with her not to risk everything for a boy she hardly knew, warning that faith-free love would inevitably collapse. Josie was steadfast, though. As best she could, she assured him that Justin was not anti-God. There was no denying his individuality. He was amazing, helpful, and sincere. He respected her strong moral convictions. She loved him unconditionally. But her words were disregarded. Her parents viewed love that didn't have their approval as disobedience. They thought about it as a mark against the family's honor and an act of rebellion. The argument went on for a long time. Voices rose and tears were poured, turning a once holy house into a battlefield. Jim Bob accused her of betraying everything they had taught her. Michelle grieved as she saw her daughter destroy her own future. But Josie was not angry. She was completely hopeless. She was attempting to make her point. It was to acknowledge that love may exist without rules, as well as worry. But what she said meant nothing. At last, Jim Bob's voice pierced the din, cold and decisive. Their home would no longer accept her. He forewarned her against marrying Justin. It was not a warning. It was a short sentence. Michelle looked away as her children stared at her. She was abandoned even by those who had taught her to love and forgive. Josie sat alone in her room that night, lost in the quiet of a home that no longer seemed like it belonged. When she looked at the pictures on the wall, pictures of smiling people in perfect conditions, she realized that most of those smiles were fake. For a long time, she had prioritized the needs of others before her own. But she was going to pursue her passions for the first time in her life. As the dawn rose, Josie began gathering her things. The courage to face whatever came next while carrying only a little backpack and a few pieces of clothing. She was unable to love her family despite everything. Although she had come to the realization that love was not about controlling them, it did not lessen her deep love for them. She stepped out of the home into the cool morning air. It was a feeling she hadn't had in a long time. Freedom all at once. It was awful as well as lovely. Down the road someplace was waiting for him. She had no idea what lay next. She was sure of one thing in spite of the difficulty, maybe even the regret. Finally, she was writing her own story, motivated by hope rather than resentment. That was the final straw that led Josie Duggar to leave the community that had raised her. When Josie left her family's house that morning, she was met with a quiet, pale sky. It was a daybreak that instilled courage and grief rather than happiness. She walked away from the house with a heaviness in her step. Still, every breath she breathed brought a small sense of relief. Moving in the direction of an unknown was her first time. Not someone else's future, but her own. Justin was standing by the beaten car at the end of the road, which was a horrifying sight. Grin. He remained silent. Nobody asked her to give him an explanation. He looked at her with a look of subtle understanding. Josie jumped in and then jumped out of the only world she had ever known. Between them there was more than simply silence. The weight of broken promises and the sudden loss of all she valued dragged her down. They concealed a. After hours of driving through rural communities, Justin spent weeks renovating a small flat. It was a small living space with reverberating walls and an outdated furniture. On the other hand, Josie felt free. It was her first really independent home, as far as she was concerned. She didn't need permission from anyone to live, to speak, or even to smile. Nevertheless, she soon learned that independence came with a cost. She didn't know how. Being separated from her family would be difficult. Without guidance, decisions had to be made, bills had to be paid, and groceries had to be bought. Josie tried to get used to the routine of her new life as Justin worked long hours at the business. After growing up in a family with 19 siblings and helping out with everything, I felt uncomfortable spending hours by myself. She missed the constant motion and constant talk of her loved ones. Even the regimen that she hated is not holy. She would occasionally ponder whether her parents missed her when she sat at the window and gazed at the city lights. Days dragged on for weeks. Justin did his utmost to calm Josie, but she carried invisible wounds. Sometimes she would wake up from a dream in which her mother's voice called out to her. She would occasionally try to SMS her sisters but discover that they were no longer replying. Her family's silence spoke louder than words could express. She refused to give up even after we spoke. She was acquired by Josie. My very first job was a part-time job at a nearby cafe. It was not pretty at all, but it gave her a sense of pride she had never had before. She learned to earn, to make mistakes, and to rely on herself. With her first paycheck, she felt like she was receiving more than simply money, proof she was capable and independent. However, she did not always get along with Justin. She understood that love was more than just escaping together. Making it through as a team was the main goal. One important point of conflict was money, which resulted in days that are unpleasant and unclear. At times, Justin struggled to understand Joss's past suffering. He wanted to protect her, but she needed to learn how to protect herself. Despite the challenges, there were some enjoyable moments. There was a lot of laughter, late-night chatter, quiet dinners, and mornings spent making plans for a life that seemed entirely their own in their tiny apartment. Josie began to improve little by little. Instead of seeing herself as the disobedient daughter, She started to consider herself a lady negotiating the difficulties of life. The letter finally came. One afternoon, Josie found an envelope that had been pushed under the door. She recognized the handwriting as that of her mother. For a long time she refused to open it. Her hands trembled and she finally tore it open. There were only a few wobbly words written on it, nothing accusatory or harsh. "We love you so much, Josie. But even though we don't always agree with you, you are still our daughter. Your choices. Travel safely." Tears filled her eyes as she repeatedly read those phrases. It wasn't mercy, no. The emotion was love, not acceptance. Far away but very much alive, damned. After leaving home, Josie at last felt at ease. She was no longer under pressure to put herself or her family first. As she and Justin sat there, she whispered softly, "Perhaps one day they will remember me not as the one who left, but as the one who learned to endure life." Looked at the stars that night while sitting on the balcony. Justin smiled and tightened his hold on her hand. As he noted, "And maybe one day, they'll realize you never stopped loving them." Josie could still see the sky over her family's home despite the distance. She also at last felt as though she only belonged in one location. Her heart was whole. There was still much for her to do. Although the pain persisted, she had found a way to release it that was far superior to defiance. It only required. She needed to start afresh in order to find her own voice. After the letter arrived, months passed in rather quiet conditions. Joseph's suffering began to give way to a softer kind of grief, the kind that doesn't break you but instead lies dormant inside you like a scar.